evening, everybody. My name is Brian Peete. I'm with the Riley County Police Department. And I really want to thank you all very much for coming here. This is a very difficult subject, but in light of things that have happened recently, I've gotten a lot of calls, concerns about what is the Riley County Police Department doing to keep Riley County and Manhattan safe. And I think that it's really important for us to make sure we let those who we serve know what we're doing to try to ease anxiety. And it just ultimately takes a community effort. So moving forward, for folks who are here, I don't see any I see a lot of young people in this room. But for anyone who may be online, and may have their children watching, the sad, unfortunate thing is we live in a day and age that now we have to talk to our children about active shooter violence. Now teachers and administrators have to train students on what to do if the unthinkable has ever happened in their schools. And so it is something I think that kids need to hear at the appropriate level, but this is also by its very nature a very traumatic thing to talk about. So in the event of these conversations, I encourage anyone in this room or anyone who's online, if you do find yourself a little bit anxious, if you do have more questions about this presentation or about this topic, please reach out to me directly. If it's something that we can do to help you with peer-to-peer support or chaplaincy that we have within our agency, I can definitely do those warm handoffs to help people and to help their families. So I'll begin with talking about targeted violence. This is something that all of us know as active shooter violence. But in the law enforcement community, we call it targeted violence. And we don't limit it to just active shooters because targeted violence, it's violence. It can be anything from weapons, from guns, knives, to vehicles. So when we talk about targeted violence, we use the Secret Service's definition. And that definition is pretty much, it's a premeditated act of violence that is directed at a specific group or location, and it's mainly due to an ideology, to a thought, to a representation that this person or this group or this entity or this institution is something that I really don't like. And I'll talk more about grievances as we go through. But this is not a situation in which there's a robbery and I plan to do this robbery, and throughout the course of the robbery I shot and killed someone. One can say that is a premeditated thing potentially, but when we talk about targeted violence, it's much, much more than that. There's a pathology that's involved with this. So I want to hit on some truths, some myths about it. One of the myths, a lot of times when we talk or when we see, unfortunately, and I shouldn't even have to say a lot, but when active shooter situations happen in the media, on social news or social media, everything to that effect, a lot of people run towards mental health. And they say, well, it's mental health issue. We need to do more with mental health. And yes, we do need to do a lot more with mental health. But just because someone has a mental illness does not mean that they're predispositioned to committing violence. As a matter of fact, people who suffer from mental health illness are more likely to be victims of crime rather than perpetrators of it. So that's a huge myth that we want to dispel. And again, I'll go more into the pathology of it. I saw, unfortunately, somebody posted something online after the shooting that happened in Minneapolis, and they talked about the shooter. And they brought up very bluntly that it was using some language that I don't want to repeat here in this room, but because of the shooter's perceived sexual preference or how the shooter identified himself, that person came right out and just blanket statement everyone, which was part of that demographic. And that's another myth too. Your race, your sexuality, your preference, any of that stuff has nothing to do with the predisposition to active shooter violence. It boils down to pathology. And there is no such thing as a profile. Back in the days of Robert Ressler and some of the other good folks from the FBI, they talked about things like profiling serial killers, and based on this crime, I believe that the serial killer still lives with their mom. They drive a red car. They do this. There's no such thing as that. But what we do look at is through research are what are the behavioral indicators of someone who is possibly planning violence. And that's where all of us as a community come in and how we can be preventative towards active shooter violence. As I mentioned before, it's pathology. I could be a person who's thinking about doing something because aimed at the government for some reason. I could be thinking about doing something to the school because of whatever reason, or this business for whatever reason. But I could also be suffering from depression or anxiety. You know what? I just happen to be a person who is going to do something very bad who just happens to be depressed or have anxiety issues. It's not or never the other way around. So what are the signs for active shooter violence? The majority of the times, these things don't just simply occur. Contrary to popular belief, there are ways to see this as it's coming. And everybody holds a small piece to the puzzle to this. So when I talk about behavioral communicator indicators, it's something as simple as you get a phone call or an email message, and you know the difference. I see some elected officials in here. There's a difference between, XY local community issue. And then there are those emails that kind of make you say, oh my God, do I really want to go to the grocery store with my family because there's just something not quite right, because there's a threat, or there's some very descriptive language that's personal, that's directed towards you, that's outside of the constituency. And those are the types of things that by reporting that to law enforcement or security or other different places that we need to know about, because they're part that brings a bigger picture to the whole. If they're making very threatening statements towards you, we can learn more if they're making threatening statements towards someone else, or if they're doing things like research, or if they're doing things like trying to buy weapons to carry out something. We need those pieces of the puzzle to move forward on acting on folks like this. And when I also talk about profiling, there are different layers to this. It's very, very nuanced, because you can have individuals who are sometimes, and I don't want to glorify it, and I don't want to belittle the crimes that they've done, but I think in a lot of cases, through outreach and community resources, you can reach someone who kind of like suicide, because a lot of active shooters commit suicide at the end. So if you can try to prevent or target the issues that's making a person thinking about violence and suicide, I think you can reduce the chances of them carrying out target violence in the first place. So you have those folks, maybe potentially a cry for help, potentially, and then you have people who are just inherently wanting to do harm to someone else. So some of the other behavioral signs, they're not limited to, but again, as I mentioned, threats and grievances. A grievance is a perceived wrongdoing, and they're projecting that on you. So you may have someone, if you're a doctor, someone who calls into the office and says, you know what, you all did surgery on my leg 8 months ago, and it's worse now than it ever was, and you guys need to pay. Rather than, well, you're getting a little bit older, your leg won't heal as much as it was. There's no reason behind that. There's a grievance. I can't walk because it's your fault. It's something you did. There's a thing out there with youth. It's involuntary celibacy. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of incel culture, but they would say it's a misogynistic based thing. So they may say, well, the reason I can't get a girlfriend is because women are this, and this. Or guys are just way too nice and too pretty, and I'm stuck here. I can't get a date. I can't get anything. It's a projection of blame. But it's not just those things. But just keep in mind, a grievance could be anything. One thing to also remember are a high percentage, a majority of target violence situations have a domestic base to them. Whether it's the attacker attacks a family member and does a family annihilation, or like what we saw in Minneapolis, that it might have been his mom's job, but there's some link to a domestic situation. Or in a lot of cases, unfortunately, for those who own businesses around here. Listen and talk to your employees, know what's going on in their lives, not only because it's the right thing to do as a leader, but you also want to keep that person safe, because more often than not, if somebody's going through a severe domestic violence situation at home, there's a lot of times that person may result to coming to the business where she's working and commit violence there. So I would encourage anyone, if you wanted to know more about that, you can simply Google that, how many, or you can research past domestic or targeted violence situations, and you'll see exactly how many. The ones that get the news, unfortunately, are the kids. But there's a lot that happen in the workplace. In that visual, or in that, the graphic that I have right there, you'll see it's like a pathway towards violence. It starts with a grievance, a fascination, and then stressors. That's the other thing I didn't mention. Stressors could be anything that, imagine if you have a person who has a perceived grievance about this, and now there are other things that are going on. Now they're having problems paying their mortgage. They're having problems, their car has broken down. Anything that has happened that would add more stress in their life, their daily activities, that's a stressor. And that compounds this whole sense of, I'm just going to do something. So again, the more stressors we see, the more prone somebody may be to committing active violence. So we have the grievance, fascination, stressors, then your target selection. Who's the perceived wrongdoer that brought to this situation? Then you have planning and groundwork, and in some cases, testing and surveillance. I was in one jurisdiction, I won't mention it specifically, but we got word that, now I would think that everyone in this room would know the difference, that if somebody said, man, you know what, I hate this school, I wish it would blow up. That's a very disturbing statement to make, and we know nowadays you don't say stuff like that. So something's gonna happen. But then it would be something different if the teacher came to you and said, I overheard Brian saying, every day at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Smith goes out back to smoke a cigarette. So what I think I'm going to do is get the weapon from my dad's house, I'm gonna hide it in the bushes behind, I'm gonna prop open that back door, and then when Mrs. Smith comes back in from her cigarette break, I'll be able to come inside of the school. That's planning, that's surveillance, that is something that's more alarming. So those are the different types of things when I talk about communication that we need to talk about. But ultimately, as I mentioned before, there has to be a presence of psychopathology. There has to be something that dehumanizes everyone else. It's easier to commit violence against somebody if you don't see them as a human being. So as I mentioned before, you can have a mental health issue, you can have behavioral disorders, you can have intellectual disabilities. You just happen to be a person with those disabilities or with that crisis. It's another thing to be someone who has a psychopathology or psychosis to commit violence. As I mentioned before, a disproportionate number of past targeted violent incidences have a nexus to domestic violence in some capacity. And again, it's not the traditional domestic violence that we think about, even though that's bad. It could be any connection to domestic violence. So those are some of the indicators that we as law enforcement would be looking at as we try to figure out the totality of the circumstances to determine the level of concern we have for this person and what we're going to do and how we're going to respond to that. There's a term called leakage, and no, it's not when I get older and I'm wearing a certain level of, from a different aisle out there at Dillon's. Leakage is the inadvertent or even the deliberate way of communicating to somebody you're going to do something. It could be something as simple as what we would think about. Johnny posts on Facebook a picture of weapons and saying, school's out tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Or it could be something that Johnny's talking to Susie and tells Susie, I really can't stand this place. I wish I would die, and if I die, I'm taking these 3 people with me. Susie should tell mom, mom should tell the police and the school, because everyone needs to know. And I think in some unfortunate situations, in some jurisdictions, you may have schools that think that it's a school issue, and we have state and federal laws that we can't share student disciplinary information. And then you might have the good old police department that says, well, we don't share information with anyone because it's an active case. When that happens, nobody wins. So the best practice in dealing with this is what's called a behavioral threat assessment team, or BTAT, and I'll go into that momentarily. So what is the Riley County Police Department doing to keep this community safe? That BTAT that I talked about. We have a new policy that's coming out, and normally it just formalizes what we normally do. But if you have a behavioral threat assessment team, and you only normally see this in departments of major metropolitan areas. I did a presentation on this 2 years in a row at the CIT International Conference and asked people, rooms of roughly 100 to 150 first responders, CIT, mental health professionals, has anyone heard of a behavioral threat assessment team? And I might only get 2 hands in that audience. And these are the people who are at the pinnacle of what they do in mental health and crisis response. But a behavioral threat assessment team, you will have a pillar. You will have a law enforcement, you have a prosecutorial attorney, and you will have a community mental health partner from my preference or vantage point. And when these types of threats come in or a report comes in, this group would get together and try to say, okay, this could be something, this could be nothing. How many resources or how much resource do we pour into this? And if it is something that is particularly disturbing and it pertains to the school, oh, you bet your bottom dollar we're gonna reach out to the school administrator. We're gonna reach out to anyone in that school and ask them, hey, this is what's going on. Come sit at the table with us. Because you have information that may seem small to you, something as simple, well, 3 weeks ago, they were drawing pictures and we kind of, just did a disciplinary thing. And now we're telling you, well, we just found out 2 nights ago, this happened. We had to respond to Johnny's house, and this is what was going on in the house. Now that piece, those puzzle pieces start to become a bigger picture. And then it comes into, so then we might have, if it's a particular threat, we might recommend to the school, here's what we would do to harden the facility or to increase security there. Or we do wraparound services. So we might pull in community mental health, or we might pull in the counselors or the parents and get more information and then figure out what resources we have in the community to wrap around that person and that family to keep them from doing something like this. In some cases, you may have a person who's just set on causing harm to somebody. And in those cases, that's when we work with the prosecution and we arrest those people. Raleigh County Police Department is using advanced technology to augment our staffing. As we were speaking a little bit earlier ago, some of the technology that we've incorporated, particularly cameras, have been really good because we're solving a lot of crimes that we've never would have solved before. Things like sexual assaults or batteries in stores, that you have individuals who are touching women or other people inappropriately. Normally it's like, we don't know because we can't identify the person who did. Well, now a lot of times we had one situation in which there was a person who had assaulted several people inside of a local store. And I think by the time that person got home, our criminal intelligence unit had identified him as a suspect. So the technology that we have is pretty good. And part of that also includes outreach. Advanced training for officers, for our sworn and non-sworn officers, for our dispatchers. And I'll talk a little bit about a success story, if you will, with dispatch. But again, like I mentioned before, everyone holds a piece of the puzzle. And you have to be trained. You have to know what's out there. You have to know best practices so you can take them and you can utilize them for the safety of your community. And then finally, we've looked at applying grants, or we have applied for some grants for more security enhancements and upgrades, particularly for this year, for our rural community. We were talking with USD 383. They believed that they didn't have a need for the low threshold that we were applying for, that was available. So we concentrated on what were the needs for our rural schools at the time. But again, that's not to mean anytime Superintendent Reed or the team calls us up and asks us for something, we're going to do everything we possibly can to make sure that we provide that to them. Other things that we're doing, partnerships. Again, as I mentioned, these are key. Partnerships with K-State, partnerships with the FBI. The U.S. Secret Service has an office called the National Threat Assessment Center, or NTAC. when we get certain levels of communications or other things like that that we're maybe not as experienced or we're kind of not sure about, we can reach out to the U.S. Secret Service and to the FBI, to the Behavioral Analysis Unit, and share with them information and get ideas for next steps. But partnerships are key to everything that we do. And as I mentioned before, long-standing partnerships with the school districts to include our SROs, and especially strong partnerships with Pawnee Mental Health, the Crisis Center, which is our local center that helps survivors of domestic violence, the Chamber of Commerce, and houses of worship within our city and within our county. Fort Riley has one of the best systems I've ever seen as far as behavioral threat assessment teams that works. And I know that because there have been a couple of times that we've had calls for service or that we've gotten information and we've shared it with Fort Riley PD, and the next thing you know, they've brought together slews of individuals to get together and to talk about that soldier or that soldier's family and what they can do to help. And so that's a model in my mind, and that's something that we would like to see pushed out to the entire country as what folks should do when they're confronted with the potential threat of active shooter violence. And that's right here in our own backyard. And again, these are partners that we work with. And while it is up to law enforcement and other stakeholders to put these pieces together, it is vital that the community report it. And we have a lot of different ways of reporting it. You can do it anonymously, or you can do it in person, you can do it by phone, and we'll put up a QR code on where folks can report tips. But it is vital that you have those lines of communications open. Us as law enforcement and anyone in this room who runs an organization, a business, or a school, you want to encourage people to, if you see something, say something, no matter how small it seems. So again, that brings us to what you can do. And folks out there in the community, as I mentioned before, it's a puzzle piece. Not one person is seldomly going to have, Brian's looking at doing this. I found that he did X, Y, Z, this, that, and that it's all spelled out for us. We have to do our diligence collectively. But it's incumbent upon first responders and law enforcement to lead that. Report, report, report. Encourage employers to develop safety plans for the employees. One of the biggest issues with domestic violence, as I mentioned, we all know how important domestic violence is when we talk about targeted violence now. Don't run away from domestic violence. A lot of times, a lot of people will say, it's not my problem, I'm not comfortable getting involved in that. You have to help people. 9 times out of 10, or most often, when somebody's in need and they're in crisis, they're gonna be upset with whoever made that report. But as they're being helped through that crisis and they transition over to being survivors, they're gonna be thankful. And I also put that to each of us in this room. The Riley County Police Department looks at things like when we talk about the downtrodden, when we talk about people who are suffering from mental illness, when we talk about people who are suffering from substance abuse disorders, when we come into contact with them, we can't dehumanize them. Because that's someone's brother, sister, mother, father, daughter, son. And we would ask ourselves, if the parent was doing everything they could and now their child is in crisis, and you come into contact, if that was your child, what would you want the police to do? How would you want them to help? So I think that putting that empathy, that humanization is something that we all need to be brave to do, and reporting domestic violence is a big part of that. So some cases, when I dropped my daughter off for school after the situation had happened, there were a lot of parents that were, I know a lot of parents hugged the kids a lot tighter that night, that day, and that afternoon. But I started to notice that there were a lot of parents that were staying longer, not just saying, you know what, I need to be back at the office. Well, you know, being back at the office in most cases, 10 minutes late, not gonna hurt anything. So it takes a community to figure out little ways that you can do to keep folks safe. And talk about mental health and suicide. If someone's ever thinking about suicide, you're not putting the idea in their head by saying suicide, by asking them, have you ever thought about suicide? You're not putting that idea in their head. If they're thinking about suicide, 9 times out of 10, they're gonna say, yes, I've thought about it, and here's how I'm gonna do it. And in those cases, alarm bells go off. I'm not just talking about targeted violence, but even through these best practices, we may come into contact with individuals who are not going to commit violence against somebody else. But because we have a best practice and a threat assessment team, these are people who are not going to otherwise slip between the cracks because we know they're at a crisis point and we may be able to intercede. And I would encourage you, or anyone, people who are out there, to contact our public information office, our team, contact our department if you want to look at your safety plans, if you want to look at things that are designed to keep your building, your employees, and your guests safe. The Riley County Police Department will work with anyone who asks any questions or needs help. So I'll talk briefly about some success stories. Folks may remember last year we had an individual who was walking throughout our community with an AR weapon strapped across his body, strapped across his back. Long story short, that individual actually shot himself in the foot, and we were able to confiscate his weapon because of that. But beside that, in addition to the anxiety that folks in this community had, the amount of communication and information sharing that was going on to the police, and especially between the students at K-State, was incredible. So again, communication is the key to talking to each other and reporting things of concern to law enforcement. The swatting calls that we had about a week ago. The training is encompassed in what we do in the Riley County Police Department, and I don't want to Monday morning quarterback what other agencies did and how they handled the situation. I'd rather have an overboard response than an under response in situations like that. But part of training is understanding, is trying to slow down and trying to stay focused and realizing the little innuendos that are in a call for service that may not quite be there. So normally if you have an active shooter situation, you'll get one call, you'll get a second call, then you'll get a flood of calls. Then you know something is going on. Once you get that first call, you can send folks out there with a sense of exigency and then report back to verify if it's something that happens. Because unfortunately, not only do we have active shooters situations, but we have sick people, quite frankly, that think it's a joke for whatever reason, and they call in these instances. And these are very dangerous because you have law enforcement flying in from all different locations, where people are trying to cross the street, go to work, move from class, building to building, and then you also have the threat of law enforcement speeding up, pulling out their weapons, and going from room to room to room to room to room. And I love the Riley County Police Department. I know we are exceptionally trained, but I think that anytime someone has a weapon out, it increases the likelihood of someone getting hurt unintentionally. So this is why swatting calls are dangerous. In the Riley County Police Department, if you go back and you look at the news footage, knock on wood, for future incidences, but you won't see footage of the Riley County Police Department breaking windows, screeching in, moving in, hup, 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 hup. That creates more anxiety, more fear. So my hat's off to our dispatchers, to our officers, and how they responded to that situation. And then finally, I'm not sure if folks know, but just very recently we had an individual who had made some very disturbing threats or levels of communication to the Catholic parish here within the community. That person had a grievance, and they believed the grievance was the Catholic faith and how they were, in a nutshell, I'm over summarizing it, but how just the faith and how people were preaching. And that was that person's grievance. And there were some very disturbing things that we were to learn about this individual as those reports went through. We did our investigation. We worked with the Riley County attorney, and this individual who represented himself was convicted. So again, these are things that, yay, we did great, but they're close to home. So we are one tribe, we are one community, Riley County. And that's the blessing of being here, is a sense of camaraderie, is a sense of family, is a sense of community. So this is what makes my job a lot of fun, but this is what gives me a lot of confidence during those sleepless nights, is if something like that could ever happen here. A crisis can happen anywhere. But I think because we look out for each other as a community, and we will continue to look out for each other, the odds of something like that happening here, we can stop that. So if anyone walks away from this discussion with anything, it's not that you're powerless to do anything about it. These things normally aren't random. They normally build up. And we're here, and I think we do a very, very good job collectively as a community to intercede when we need to intercede. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions here on the slide. You'll see some pictures of some very nice people with faces for radio. Major Asher, Corporal Peete, and PIO Kinder, they're here in the room. And then we have some links that are up, and we can distribute this out throughout social media if folks do need to reach out. Are there any questions I can answer from anyone?
I've got a cramp in my legs, so I'm gonna stand. But I do have a question. If I called and said, you know, here's what I heard somebody say, you talked about them, what do you do at the office? I would give it to the person that answers the phone because I wouldn't want to take any more time. So I'd want to dump that and go. But what do you take down everything? How do you log it? Talk about your process there.
So I'll briefly jump into it, and then I'll turn over to Rachel, because Rachel can also speak to it because she came out of our investigation section as well. But we're going to take that information down, and then we're going to share it amongst each other, especially particularly, I think, our criminal intelligence unit. So it's the CIU. So we have Sergeant Dunn, Josh is in there as well. No, not Josh, Mold's there, and then we have another gentleman, Mario, who's in there. So we have 3 people who are very, very good at analysis. So they would pull up calls for service, everything that we could about that particular individual, and then work with other officers to see if there's more of a piece to that puzzle. So I don't know if Rachel, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's a good example of kind of what would happen. So it goes into our criminal intelligence unit, and what they do is they do what we call a deep dive. So they look at any calls for service that they may have been previously connected to, and then they actually let the detective know what their relation was to that. Were they a victim? Were they just a reporting party? Did they witness it? Were they a suspect in that incident? And then that way we are able to look at that, and then we take our time to go and maybe do like a neighborhood canvas, talk to other individuals. We would probably reach out to you and see if you'd be willing to speak with us further if you had time on another date. But we would do kind of what we can to see if there's a criminal incident that has occurred, or if we can pass them on to one of our community care teams.
So you accumulate, I would assume then,
yes,
information so that if there's another call or another
yeah, and we have things that are called field interview cards, and so it's not a filed report because if there's no criminal incident that occurs, we can still tag it to their name so that only an officer or detective would be able to look at that, but they would be able to use it if there were certain things that happened in the future.
Yes, ma'am.
What does RCPD do for notification of community if there's an event? I'm sure it's a fine line between not creating a panic in the community, yet letting people know safety reasons. Like, what is that release of information that you guys do?
So I'll turn that over to Major Asher behind you, but I'll, depending on the situation, but one of my, well, not one of, but my ask of the PIO office is maximum information, minimal delay. We should not be holding information that's going to keep our community safe. One example, in Canada, there was an individual who shot and committed arson, killing, I believe, over 20 people. This person was a pseudo cop wannabe, had an old Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniform, an old vehicle that was salvaged from the police department, and the police got, again, I don't want to armchair quarterback, but they didn't put information out to the public saying, hey, there's a person who's pretending to be a police officer who's doing this. There's a person who just did this in this neighborhood. And I think as a result of not sharing that information, for whatever reason, that person was not apprehended sooner or stopped sooner. But I'll turn it over to Major Asher.
Yeah, I think the director kind of hit the nail on the head. So obviously when we get a call for service, and I'll just use something like, say there's something, an event up at a school, one of the high schools, one of the grade schools, obviously we want to let parents know, we want to let the surrounding people know, we want to let the school itself know. So obviously the first thing we want to do is confirm there's an actual incident. We don't want to put out misinformation. because then everybody starts copying the misinformation. So then we confirm that there is something going on. We then utilize our PIO office, which we have set screens and kind of set releases that we use, and we start doing notifications that way. We then work with other PIOs in our community, so the City of Manhattan, Riley County, and we use them to help springboard our message off. And then as we continue to solve the problem and fix it, we continue posting updates. We have Everbridge, which we can notify throughout Riley County. We also utilize our social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, other social media sites, and then try to do a wraparound kind of at the end internally. What could we have done better? What did we do well? What did we do poor? What can we improve upon? And then we usually make connections with, if it's a business, if it's a school where the incident happened, to try to perform better in the future. But we do have some playbook type templates that we do follow, and then after each incident, we evaluate to try to do a better job in the future.
And to add on that one, ma'am, is the other part is whenever I could, I will report information. Again, very good relationships with Scott French and Manhattan with the city manager. So we're going to be reporting information to them, so they'll be able to funnel it out, because a lot of times constituents for elected officials are going to be reaching out to their elected officials asking what's going on. And so when we put out correct information to everybody as fast as possible, it really reduces stress, because I think the majority of people want to know, what can I do to help? And you have to harness that community sense that we have here in Manhattan and Riley County for the benefit of everybody. One of the other things I'm very, very grateful for is that we have a very good relationship. It's non-adversarial with the media. So if the media reaches out to us, whether it's local, whether it's regional TV, WIBW, KSNT, whoever, we share information with them, because it is their job and their responsibility and their oath to be the voice, the eyes and ears of the people. And they can help us disseminate the right information. If we don't get information out to the public, that's when you get someone says, I heard this on Facebook, and people who are desperate for information are gonna hold on to what they know. And again, this also goes back to, if that were my child, my family, or anything else like that, we owe it to you as public servants to tell you what's going on as fast as we possibly can. Are there any other questions I can answer for
I
any?
have a question about,
Yes,
you're talking about the personality of a person who commits these crimes. Do we have any studies or idea how long somebody dwells on this idea before they act? Is there any kind of time frame? Is it just always just on the spur of the moment? No, it can't be. They have to get a weapon, they have to get organized, but what's the time frame of this thoughtful?
Looking at previous studies, the answer to that one is it depends. So there are other cases that, in certain cases, that you may have someone who is planning something in the event that there is leakage and someone reaches out to them, and a lot of times you can tell also based on how you're going to reach out and connect with that person. That may, in some cases in the past, that spurred the individual to just go ahead, drop what they were doing, and do something a lot sooner than they had planned. There are other individuals that it may become a passion with stressors as a contributor. So they may be thinking about doing something, then I lost my job and it's this person's fault that happened, and it's this, and now I gotta pay this bill and I don't have it, and just a compound of those situations that happen. Or in other cases, I can think of one that happened in New York, where there was an individual who stabbed his ex, who stabbed her mom, and other folks. His was psychosis, but also drug-induced. So depending on the situation, but depending on the individual. So that's why it's very important for people to give us as much information, for us to do our due diligence, and to determine a level of concern. And if we're dropping everything to deal with this now, or if this is something that we can take a little bit more time to dig deeper and to get all of our partners involved. Yes, ma'am.
Do you, RCPD, ever go out into the schools just to check things and make sure there's no threats that we don't see in the school, or kind of like we do a fire inspection every year, you know, do y'all do anything like that?
Yes, so the answer to that one is most definitely. We have, for here in Manhattan, we have 2 officers, or school resource officers, they are assigned to the high school. We don't have any officers for the middle schools or the elementary schools, but those officers will work with the principals there. As far as like more of the private schools, we are planning to do more of that, and I know Major Asher is going to put a little bit more information on that one, but we also encourage officers to stop by, say hello, see how things are going, and not even just for targeted violence, but we also have another program that it's the, which one is it? The, for kids that we had a call for service the night before. Handle with Care program. In other words, that if, say for example, if Rachel and I went on a call for service last night, it was a domestic related incident at a school or for a child at this school, we would reach out to the SRO, or we would reach out directly to that school and say, hey, this happened last night. When Johnny comes to school, you may want to do some background support. But Major Asher.
Yeah, so something we do, and I think your question was also about like security in the school, like do we do security checks? So something we do yearly is we do training globally for Riley County. So we invite EMS, we invite the fire department, we invite the school, 383, we've done training up in the North County at our schools, and we do like active shooter type training. So if you can imagine, there's a mass shooting that may or may not occur at a school. Maybe our incident is a crash, a very bad crash. We do an active type training, a large one once a year, and USDA 383 and the other schools in our county are usually invited. As well as we also have 2 persons that are inside of our department that also will help with school security if the schools request it, or we put it on from time to time. A lot of times we want to create a safe environment in the school. All of our schools have some forms of a lockdown type procedures in that they share with us, as well as we also help give guidance on that, how that occurs, if that makes sense. One of the things that we've done recently, and I don't know the exact number of years, but like our key cards, here's a great example. We used to have a ring of keys. I can remember when I started. I've been at the department for 25 years. And so imagine going to the school, okay, and then you're digging through keys. And you're like, oh, I think it's this one. I kind of know it's this one. Whereas now we have a key card, and it's tied to all of our officers. So every officer, from the highest ranking to the very lowest ranking, can get into the schools, any of the schools, and they're able to access in a very quick manner to help with security. You know, again, we do our yearly training. We take requests. I know the SROs that are at the high school do a lot up there. And then some programs that Rachel and I are going to start doing are trying to meet with the schools at the beginning of the year as well as the end of the year to find out what they more want. Recently, we went to Ogden at the beginning of the year, gave a safety talk. It was more geared towards younger children because it's a grade school. But yes, we do, to answer your question, do some training with the schools.
And I'll be happy to report, based on my interactions and the reports that I know we have internally, all of our schools within this county are very, very safety conscious, and I would feel safe asking my daughter or having my daughter enrolled in any of the schools within this county. Are there any other questions I can answer for anyone? Nothing online? Nobody said anything about me looking like Shrek? All right. Thank you all very much for your time and for the opportunity to speak with you, and I really appreciate you. Thank you.